They called it the age of powder and perfume. But beneath the lace cuffs and powdered wigs, something crawled, something alive, something intimate. In the grand salons of 17th century France, where chandeliers wept candlelight onto marble floors and whispers of politics hid behind fans of silk, lice, yes, were not merely tolerated. They were adored. To the untrained mind, it is unthinkable. Vermin on skin, in beds, in hair? Yet for the decadent aristocracy, the presence of lice was more than inconvenience. It was eroticism distilled into its most primal form. We begin in the year 1664, in the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, whose golden halls at Versailles shimmered with orchestrated beauty and masked corruption. Amid the opulence lived a woman history dared not remember by name, only by scent and scandal. They called her La Dame aux Grattements, the Lady of Scratching. And she was exquisite. Her boudoir smelled of ambergris, civet musk, and lavender, a fragrance not meant to mask, but to mingle. Her hair, piled high with stiffened flour and scented oils, concealed not only jewels, but an entire miniature kingdom of lice, each one said to have tasted the blood of counts and courtiers. She did not hide them. No, she flaunted them. With ivory nails, she would slowly rake her scalp as she spoke, letting the bloodless itch ripple down her spine, drawing the eyes of every man in the room. It was not shame, it was seduction. Lice were her aphrodisiac, her talisman, her rebellion against the sterile, the sanitized, the soulless. At court, this trend began to spread like wine on silk. Parasites became paradoxes. The very creatures that once symbolized poverty now signaled privilege. Peasants feared them, nobles cultivated them. A woman might lift her hem just high enough to reveal a tiny silver comb tucked into her garter, a suggestive signal that she was not only infested, but available. Why, you ask? Why would the most refined members of society embrace the repulsive? The answer, like all truths of that age, lies in contradiction. The 17th century was a war against nature and death. Plague loomed in memory, hygiene was distrusted, and cleanliness was believed to weaken the body's vital essences. Bathing was rare, perfume abundant, and in this stew of superstition and sensuality, lice, those little blood-drinking stowaways, came to represent the rawness of life. They were proof of warmth, of contact, of being touched and touching in return. A lover who bore no lice was suspicious. Had he not lain with others? Had he not shared sweat, furs, whispers? The absence of lice was the absence of intimacy. And so, to love in that era was to scratch, to itch, to bleed just a little beneath layers of brocade. The great Madame de Pompadour, though she would be born nearly a century later, was rumored in apocryphal texts to have said, "A louse upon the temple is worth a diamond on the brow." Whether she said it or not, it captured the spirit of those years. And yet, not all saw this trend as beautiful. There were whispers, there were warnings. In the narrow streets of Marseille, an alchemist named Father Remy wrote in his journal of a noblewoman he treated in secret. Her beauty was unmatched, he claimed. Her smile intoxicating. But her scalp, a ruin of burrowed trails, red crescents of skin, and tiny eggs that gleamed like pearls under candlelight, haunted him. She believed herself holy, he wrote, chosen by divine vermin. And when she died, he claimed the lice refused to leave her body, feeding until her blood cooled into silence. That journal was dismissed by the Academy. Burned, they say. Yet fragments survive. So when we look at the portraits from that age, when we gaze into the still eyes of duchesses and see the powdered splendor of their coiffed hair, we must remember what lies beneath. Not only secrets, not only scandal, but motion. Tiny, insistent motion. A courtship played out in miniature upon their flesh. In the next chapter, we descend deeper into the rituals, into the love poems written to lice, the duels sparked by accusations of delousing, and the underground societies that fetishize the creatures as divine messengers of desire. But first, let the idea settle in you. In the 1600s, to scratch was not to suffer. It was to be seen. In a hidden wing of the Château de Blois, buried behind layers of tapestries depicting saints and centaurs, there once met a society of whispered name, les amants de l'itch, the lovers of the itch. Their sigil, pressed in wax onto envelopes of perfumed parchment, bore not a rose nor a dove, but a single six-legged silhouette. They were nobles, poets, physicians, and yes, even clergy. Their doctrine was not written but passed from body to body, through bedsheets, through pillow seams, through long embraces held too long beneath velvet canopies. Their gatherings were never announced. A red ribbon tied around a balcony post, a servant sent with a sealed comb, or a book of psalms returned with a louse tucked delicately between the pages. These were their invitations. And what took place inside their candlelit chambers was not carnal in the way we moderns would expect. It was reverent, almost liturgical. There, a woman might bare her neck, not for kisses, but for examination. A man might kneel, not to propose, but to comb gently through the powdered mass of her wig, searching for movement. Each discovered louse was cradled between fingernails, held up like a sacred relic, then released upon the skin with hushed awe. The act was called la consécration, the consecration. It was believed that to share lice was to bind two souls in unspeakable closeness, deeper than words, deeper even than touch. Poetry bloomed around the phenomenon. The court poet Philippe Artaud, long banished from official records, once penned this now lost sonnet, only fragments of which remain. Let thy fingers stray like pilgrims through my hair, that sacred nest where holy creatures dwell. Each bite they give, a kiss from angels bear, each drop of blood, a tale they thirst to tell. Such verses were passed in secret, hidden in cuff linings or sewn into corsets. If discovered, they could spell ruin. Yet the allure was too potent to resist. Entire salons would gather in semi-darkness to recite such stanzas, their voices trembling not with shame, but longing. It wasn't only art. Science, too, took an interest, twisted though it may seem. In 1671, the physician Dr. Etienne Vallon presented before a circle of Parisian natural philosophers his thesis, Sur les vertus aphrodisiaques des poux, on the aphrodisiacal virtues of lice. He argued that the constant irritation of the scalp stimulated the blood, awakened the senses, and increased sensitivity to touch. He was laughed out of the academy. 3 months later, he was found dead in his laboratory, scalp shaved raw, and over 4,000 lice preserved in glass vials surrounding his corpse. His last written words, scrawled on the back of an anatomy diagram, read only, "I felt everything." And while the court played with lace and metaphor, the peasantry watched in silence. For them, lice were not symbols, but scourges. They burned bedding, shaved heads, and boiled garments in iron pots. They saw in the nobility's rituals not romance, but madness. Tensions grew. In 1675, in the region of Brittany, a young washerwoman named Jeanne Morel was accused of attempting to poison a baroness by lacing her scented hair oils with mercury. When asked why, she reportedly answered, "She wore her lice like a crown while we wore ours like shame." She was executed by public drowning. But before her death, she left behind a diary, later smuggled into the hands of les amants de l'itch. Her words were turned into catechism. They called her Saint Jean of the Scalp. From then on, a rift formed between the sacred and the scandalous. Two visions of the louse, one as holy harbinger of closeness and eros, the other as the mark of oppression and decay. But the court didn't care. By the 1680s, delosing someone without consent was considered an insult, an accusation of sterility, or, worse, social detachment. Several duels were recorded, pistols drawn at dawn over the rumor that a lady's maid had combed her mistress too thoroughly. In one case, the Viscount de Thiers challenged a rival not for a lady's heart, but because he'd overheard the man joke, "She scratches like a peasant." The Viscount was shot through the lung and died 3 days later. His dying words, it is said, were, "Let them feed without fear." Even fashion adapted. Hair was styled not just to impress, but to house. Tall powdered towers with secret compartments, honeycombed braids, padded wigs soaked in sugared oils, and beneath it all, the tickle, the hum, the presence of something alive. The lice were no longer merely insects. They were confidants, witnesses, intimate ghosts that carried the scent of passion and the memory of hands. In the next part of our story, we follow one woman, Geneviève de Noirac, known as La Mère de Bête, who would take this devotion to a terrifying extreme. Through her, the seductive dance would become a descent, and the worship of vermin would blur into obsession, sacrifice, and finally, transformation. Her name was Geneviève de Noirac, but in hushed corners of Versailles, they whispered a different name, La Mère de Bête, the mother of beasts. Born to a crumbling bloodline and a fortune held together by ancestral debt, Geneviève was neither celebrated for beauty nor wit. But she possessed something rarer, devotion, a singular, terrible devotion. It began, they say, with her wedding night. Her husband, the Count de Noirac, returned from the battlefield with a body whole but spirit shattered. He did not touch her, not once. Nights passed in silence, the bed between them colder than the marble floor. In desperation, she reached for the only intimacy left to her, her own body. And in that solitude, scratching at the base of her neck, she found company. She let them breed, not out of ignorance, but invitation. She fed them with purpose, refusing comb and soap. She whispered to them in candlelight. She felt them crawl and called it grace. When a chambermaid screamed upon seeing her shoulder swarm one morning, Geneviève did not dismiss the girl. She offered her a ribbon and said, "They love. That is all." Soon, others came to her chambers. At first, it was mockery, curiosity wrapped in scandal. But when men left her room with trembling fingers and dazed eyes, the mockery ceased. They said she could open you with a glance and sew you shut with a sigh. That her parasites carried memories, that she had bred a bloodline of lice attuned only to longing. She kept them in boxes carved from rosewood, fed them with drops of claret and goat's milk, named them after saints and poets. When she attended court, her powdered hair teemed with life, and yet no one turned away. She became an oracle of sorts. It was said that if one of her lice chose to leap from her scalp to yours during a conversation, your future was bound to hers, either in ecstasy or in ruin. The king's own mistress once asked her, half in jest, for a blessing. Geneviève leaned close and whispered, "You must bleed first." 3 nights later, the mistress shaved her own head, placed her wigs in fire, and was found cradling a silver comb slick with her own blood. The court did not speak of her again. Letters from that time revealed Geneviève's obsession deepened. She believed lice were the soul's familiars, messengers between the flesh and whatever lay beyond it. She forbade her attendants from harming even a single one. Her bedposts were hollowed to house breeding colonies. She no longer bathed. Her skin took on a sickly pallor, but her eyes, those remained brilliant, feverish, alive. The church took notice. In 1686, an anonymous denunciation was sent to the Archbishop of Reims. The letter accused her of heresy, witchcraft, and the sacred transference of bodily vermin in exchange for power over men's will. The Inquisition dismissed it as idle gossip. But within months, 3 young women from her household were dead, each with puncture marks along the spine and small nests of eggs buried in their scalps. Her manor was searched. No bodies were found. But journals, yes, dozens, bound in skin-like parchment, each page cataloging the moods, behaviors, and lineages of her lice, generations upon generations of breeding, selection, even training. She wrote of scent conditioning, of music played nightly to encourage docility, and in one passage, "I have taught them where to bite and when." By then, no one dared confront her. At masquerades, noblemen would offer strands of their own hair in velvet envelopes, pleading for her children to visit them in sleep. One duke, having been refused, later stitched his own scalp with raw meat in hopes of attracting wild lice. He died from infection, smiling. And yet, for all her power, Geneviève was lonely. She wrote of dreams, of lying with someone who understood, who bore the same bite marks, who welcomed the crawling chorus. She dreamed of a man whose blood matched hers, not in lineage, but in resonance, one who would not flinch, even as she fed her brood upon his chest. That man arrived in the winter of 1688, a physician from Prague known only as Herr K, whose papers had been banned in half of Europe. He believed in microbial souls, in love transmitted by invisible creatures, in the ecstatic potential of decay. When he met Geneviève, they did not speak. They only touched. He removed his gloves. She opened her sleeve. For hours, they sat in silence, hands entwined, as lice passed from skin to skin in sacred procession. Their union was not physical. It was parasitic. Some say they merged entirely, no longer man and woman, but host and hive. In the final entry of her journal, dated spring of 1689, Geneviève wrote, "We no longer itch, we feel harmony." She was never seen again. Herr K disappeared weeks later. His quarters found abandoned, save for an empty vial and a powdered wig filled with crawling life. The room had no scent, only the faintest vibration in the air, like whispers without mouths. In the last part of our tale, we explore how Geneviève's legacy outlived her through a final performance, a grotesque mask of blood and beauty, and the unholy relics that still haunt private collections today. They say the last time anyone saw Geneviève de Noirac, she was gliding through the Hall of Mirrors during a masked ball hosted by the Duc d'Orléans. Her face was half covered in jet black lace, her gown stitched with tiny pearl-like beads that, under closer inspection, wreathed. Those who approached her that night spoke of an aura that clung to the air around her, humid, metallic, humming faintly like breath caught in a crystal vial. She danced once, just once, with Herr K. Witnesses described it as unnatural, silent, unsynchronized, yet utterly hypnotic. As if their bodies obeyed a rhythm no one else could hear. Her fingers pressed into his neck, and his hand, pale and trembling, rested over her ribs where something pulsed just beneath the fabric. When the music stopped, they bowed, vanished into the shadows, and were never again seen in court. But they left something behind. 3 days later, the royal wig maker, a man named Théodore Lincourt, was summoned to a private residence on the edge of Versailles. The letter bore no signature, only a wax seal in the shape of an insect. Curiosity overcame caution. He arrived to find a single package on the doorstep, a wooden box lined with red velvet, and within it, a towering wig of impossible craftsmanship. It shimmered like spun moonlight. Embedded within its folds were microscopic glass tubes, threads of silver mesh, and something else, something alive. He lifted it once. Only once. A week later, Lincourt was found raving in the Seine, head shaven, body covered in symmetrical bite marks. He babbled of the chorus in the crown and the eyes beneath the scalp. He died days later, but not before sketching the wig in fevered detail. That drawing, now housed deep within the restricted collection of the Bibliothèque Nationale, shows not a fashion piece, but what appears to be a living nest, shaped like a woman's head, with roots descending like veins. It would not be the last. Throughout the 1690s, rumors surfaced of a series of underground performances, masks held in abandoned abbeys or forgotten catacombs, known only by a single whispered name, La Communion des Bêtes. No tickets, no hosts, only an invitation burned into a scrap of lace or whispered by a beggar missing half his tongue. Those who attended returned changed. They spoke of dancers veiled in gauze, moving like marionettes pulled by invisible strings, of lutes played with no hands, of women whose hair writhed midair, forming shapes, faces, limbs, wings. The finale, always the same, a woman in white stepping into a spotlight of candlelight, baring her scalp to reveal a swirling mass of living creatures arranged like a crown. As she wept, the lice would crawl down her face, into her mouth, her eyes. The audience applauded in silence. Some claimed this was Geneviève returned. Others said it was her daughter, though she never had children in any traditional sense. One account, written by a Spanish ambassador, suggested that the performers weren't human at all, but amalgams, flesh puppets animated by colonies of lice operating in perfect orchestration. They moved, he wrote, with the intelligence of a hive, not the soul of a woman. By the turn of the century, these stories became legend, dismissed as decadent hallucinations, the final death rattles of an era drunk on its own rot. The Enlightenment swept in with soap and reason. Parasites were returned to the realm of disgust, to the poor, to the forgotten. Hair was trimmed, wigs lost height, cleanliness became divine again. But Genevieve was never forgotten. Collectors of the macabre still chase her traces. A vial allegedly containing one of her royal brood sold in 1922 at a Berlin occult auction for the equivalent of 40,000 francs. It was labeled in Latin, Pediculus Dominus Noctis, Louse, Lord of the Night. It disappeared months later from a private collection in Prague, its glass shattered, its velvet cradle empty. And if you wandered deep enough into the private salons of certain families in Paris, the old names, the ones whose portraits no longer hang but whose wealth remains, you might still find, sealed behind aged mirrors or locked inside hidden drawers, strange wigs untouched by time, exhaling a faint, warm musk. So perhaps next time your scalp tingles without cause and your fingers reach up instinctively to scratch, you might wonder, is it merely irritation or is it history? Returning home? For in the 17th century, seduction was not always a whisper, a kiss, a glance. Sometimes it crawled.